Welcome to Culture Matters with Kailash, an initiative of Folk Brain. Today, we are going to talk about a very new, innovative thing. Thing is this that our Sahajanand Saraswati is taught in the American University, and the person, a professor of history, who has initiated this matter is Professor William R. Pinch. So, Professor William R. Pinch is a professor of history at Whistler University. He has been working with Professor Walter Hauser on so many things. He has been working in India. In India, also, he has been working in Bihar, in Odisha, in Assam, in Maharashtra, in Haryana, and in so many areas. He in Bengal also. He has worked on Sahajanand Saraswati. He has worked on Subhash Chandra Bose. He has worked on that Nirbhaya. He has worked on lepers, and he has worked on so many dimensions, political, social dimensions of India and Southeast Asia. So I would now not talk much about his old, because a very old friend of him, Sri Kailash Chandra Jha, who has spoken time and again about the works and creativity and power and contribution of Sahajanand Saraswati on our channel, would tell you briefly about him, and he will talk to us about his initiative. With this, I request Sri Kailash Jha to introduce our today's speaker, Professor William R. Pinch, and then we can start our Sri Jha sir. Jha sir. Hello. Jha sir. Okay, I think he's not able to join us. Meanwhile, I will request you, Professor, to please start. झा साहब आप सुन सकते हैं? Can you please introduce Professor William R. Pinch before our viewers? जी जी जी, please speak.
I can speak.
Yeah, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Professor William Pinch जाने जाते हैं. यह नाम उनका इसलिए हुआ कि वो उनका जन्म
Professor Pinch, I think Mr. Jha has some technical problem. So I would now request you to please start the initiative by which Sahajanand's Mera Jeevan Sangharsh, my life struggle, is being taught mainly in your University of Wesley, and all other initiatives. Please start speaking.
Well, first, I'll go ahead and start. Yes, thank you for the invitation to speak on Folk Brain. I've enjoyed the previous programs I've watched on Folk Brain. I watched the recordings of Kailash Jha's 3 or 4 presentations on various topics connected to preservation of records, and the preservation of records is a very important topic, and heritage and folklore is extremely important. So it's a great honor to be here to speak. And I will say that I would also like to thank Kailash Jha for not just for the introduction that he was going to give, but also just for our long association and all the incredible help he's provided, not just to me but to all scholars who work on Bihar. And our association goes back about almost 40 years now, since 1982, when I one of the things Kailash Jha was going to tell you is that I was born in India, in Delhi, in 1960. But after leaving India and Pakistan, I was raised in India and Pakistan, and after leaving Pakistan in 1975 to come to the US, I went and studied at the University of Virginia, where I met Walter Hauser in 1978-79, and because of my association with Professor Walter Hauser, I eventually returned to India in 1982 for study, and it's at that point that I met Kailash Jha, and we've been very close friends ever since. And so it's a real pleasure to be here. I think what prompted this particular program was the fact that a few weeks ago I happened to mention to Kailash Jha, I will refer to Kailash Jha as Senior Kailash, because there are two Kailashes here. And so I mentioned to Kailash that I was using the Swami Sahajanand Saraswati's autobiography, Mera Jivan Sangharsh, in my teaching. I've been doing that for years. And as I would say, many American professors, particularly students of Walter Hauser, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's been using the Swami's autobiography in their teaching. I know many of Walter's students, including Anand Young and Christopher Hill and Wendy Singer, possibly even David Laushi when he was teaching, Jim Hagan, the late Jim Hagan. Many of us have used the Swami's autobiography and other materials about the Swami, and we've taught the Kisan Sabha struggle and the Swami's activism, and in our teaching, really going back really into the 1970s. So my using the Swami's autobiography is nothing really that new. I just happened to mention it to Kailash Jha in an email a few weeks ago, and Kailash mentioned it, I think, on WhatsApp or one of those social media networks, and it sort of got picked up in the press. And so that's what led, I think, to this program. So I want to thank Kailash for, publicizing the fact, because and I would say it's we, as an academic, I teach at a university, I'm an academic, and we don't, unfortunately, when we give talks and public lectures, we don't talk enough about teaching. We mainly talk about our own research. And I think it's important on occasion to step back and think about teaching. So this is a welcome opportunity to talk about pedagogy and curriculum. Okay, so my remarks on the Swami and teaching are really divided into three parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context here in the US at the American universities, which are very different in many ways from Indian universities. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my own syllabus, the structure of my syllabus, what I teach in my modern South Asia class, modern India, modern South Asia. And I'll share with you the structure of the syllabus. And then the third part is really zooming in to think about the ways in which the Swami, I talk about the Swami's life, and I use the Swami's autobiography to illuminate issues that are important for the 20th century history of India and South Asia. So first, context. So the context is really important in history, and certainly there's no exception here. And with respect to teaching, I teach at Wesleyan University. It's a private liberal, what we call a private liberal arts college, and generally speaking, and the point I want to get across here is that teaching, the curriculum is very flexible. We don't have a centralized body that dictates what the curriculum must be. It's very flexible. It's basically up to us. My university is a private university, but I was trained at the University of Virginia with Walter Hauser, which was a public university. But in both cases, we pretty much determine our own curriculum, and we design our own syllabi, our own courses. So that's the first point I want to make. Wesleyan is a relatively small school in terms of its numbers. It's about 3,000 students, 3,000 undergraduates, which is more comparable to a college in many places, but we do think of ourselves as a university because we do have PhD programs in some subjects, not in history. So all of my students are BA students, although we do have, occasionally I'll have a graduate PhD student or a master's student come to the classroom. The size of my classes is usually in the 20s, 30s maybe, but because of the pandemic and the coronavirus this year, it's been a little bit smaller. So the size of the classroom is not quite as big. And generally in the modern South Asia class, it's a lecture discussion class. So it's about, it's more of an introductory class. But I also teach every year. Every semester I'll teach a survey course, an introductory survey, and I'll also teach an advanced seminar. Our school, our year is divided into 2 semesters. So we have a fall semester and a spring semester. And each semester, each course normally lasts the entire semester. So it's a 14 or 15 week semester. And in my introductory lecture survey class, I'll usually give, it'll be lectures twice a week on a Monday and a Wednesday. And on Friday, we'll have a discussion of the materials for that week. And I'll have them do writing assignments through the semester. There's a brief weekly writing assignment, which is a response that they mount. The students write a response to the readings and lectures, and this helps me structure the discussion on the Fridays. And then there are also 4, in this particular case, there are 4 formal short papers of 3 to 5 pages each. Okay. So again, I want to emphasize, there's a big difference, I think, between a place like Wesleyan or American universities in general and Indian universities. There's no centralized curriculum. We don't even have a university-wide core curriculum. So ours is a very open curriculum. We don't have any mandated courses that every student at the university has to take. We have distribution expectations. They're not even a requirement. It's an expectation that students will take a certain number of courses across the curriculum. And most students meet that expectation, about 3/4, 75% of the students, the 3,000 undergraduates, BA students, meet that expectation. The BA takes 4 years to complete, and unlike many Indian institutions where the BA is usually a 3-year degree. In the history, I'm a historian. I'm in the history department. And so we teach, for the major 9 courses are required, and it's a distribution of different kinds of courses. Okay, now the main point I want to get across is that there's an enormous amount of flexibility in our teaching. And to really indicate that, I will ask Dr. Mishra, Dr. Kailash Mishra, to please go ahead and put up the first slide so I can give you a sense of what the syllabus, my syllabus, looks like. And if we could get that first slide from the PowerPoint up there. So, okay, that's the first slide. Now, let's go to the next slide. Second slide, please. Aage badao. And is it possible to make the slide? I don't know if everybody can see the slide, but this is a diagram that shows the 14 or 15 weeks of the syllabus. And so each week is numbered on the left, and I've divided the kinds of materials that I use into 3 types. On the far left column are what I call the main texts of the course. These are the sort of textbooks that I use. And then in the middle column are primary source texts that I have the students read, and primary sources in history are texts that really come from the period by people writing during the time that one is examining. So original sources. And then finally on the far right, I use quite a bit of film in my teaching. And so those are films that we watch. And so every week, so for instance, in week number 1, the students began reading Yasmin Khan's book, The Great Partition. We didn't read any primary source texts, but they did watch a film, a film, Division of Hearts, which is interviews with people who survived through partition. It's a wonderful documentary film. And likewise, and then every week, so Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Monday and Wednesday I would lecture, and Friday we would have a discussion. I'll just read to you what the objective of the course is. It's very important because you have to understand that in the United States, most students have very little idea about South Asian history or India. And so we're really, the most they might know, they might have heard of Gandhi. And they probably have heard of, Prime Minister Modi, and they might know, in terms of current events, things that are going on. But for the most part, students have very little idea about India. And so really, one of the goals of the course is just to make them aware of India and South Asia and provide a nuanced history. So the learning objective of the course, I'll just read you the quote from the course catalog. This course examines the history of South Asia, mainly since the 1940s. Using a combination of memoir, history, and film, we examine key forces that have shaped South Asian post-colonial modernity, including religious nationalism, caste, language, war, migration, separatism, democracy, and economic development. The focus is on India, but we will also examine political developments in and conflicts and social and cultural intersections with neighboring nation states. Now the course, actually, it's really, I say in the description that it's mainly from the 1940s on, but really, as you can see from the readings, we're dealing with the entire, really the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. And the design of the course really begins in the middle of the century with the partition, right? And then after 3 weeks on partition, we read Yasmin Khan. Then we turn to Sunil Khilnani's book, The Idea of India, which we read over 4 or 5 weeks. And each chapter of Sunil Khilnani, which is about a 30 to 50 page chapter, I will then pair with a primary source text selection. So in week 4, I have them read a chapter from Khilnani, and then a chapter, The Annihilation of Caste by Ambedkar. In week 5, they read a chapter of Khilnani, and they read a selection, the beginning of The Discovery of India by Nehru. In week 6, they read another chapter of Khilnani, and then they read Hind Swaraj by Gandhi, etc. In week 8, they read a selection from Mera Jivan Sangharsh, My Life Struggle by Swami Sahajanand Saraswati. And then in week 9, they read a selection from Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, a recently published book of her writings called A Passionate Life. And so I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what's happening in week 8 and some of the themes about that. In week 10 through 12, we then turn to V.S. Naipaul's India, A Million Mutinies Now, and which is sort of a combination primary and secondary source text. It's a fascinating text, and I've taught it many times. And finally, we close out the semester with Aparna Vedik's recent book on lynchings and blood justice in modern India, called My Son's Inheritance, which is it's a fascinating sort of family, personal history of communal violence and the problem of liberalism and tolerance and the discourse of liberalism. And so, but what you'll notice right off the bat is that I begin in the middle of the century, and then I move forward and I move backward at the same time. So when we read Khilnani's text, we're thinking about the development of the modern Indian nation state and all of its, and particularly Khilnani's text is really an extended meditation on Nehru's, the Nehruvian project of India. And so we engage with Khilnani's text via reference to these other thinkers and writers and activists. And so we move both forward in time, but we also move backward in time. The reason for that is, I'm a historian, and I want to impress upon the students that, people understand themselves in terms of the past. And so you can't really understand the latter half of the 20th century without understanding the first half of the 20th century. And obviously that can be extended much further as well. Okay, so I'm going to say a few words about the week 8, and I guess to open that up, I'll say that in terms of the students having background, they have very little background. I do get some heritage learners, that is second generation Indian or South Asian students, and they may know something, but their knowledge is very focused and limited, usually to their region where their family may have come from. And then, of course, I get non-heritage students who have almost no idea. So they might know about Gandhi, and that's it. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. थोड़ा आगे बढ़ाइए. Okay. So now so the students read I've taught this book many times since the publication of the translation about 6-7 years ago. I've taught it, and I've taught from it even before that. But on Mondays and Wednesdays, I lecture to students. And so the kinds of things that I lecture about when we're reading the Swami, and what they've read for this week is they've really read the first 100 pages or so of the translation. So I use the Hauser and Jha translation from 2015, and they read they read actually the beginning, which is about the Swami's early life and his education and his decision to take sannyas and his travels around India, and then his gradual move into his increasing interest into politics. I don't actually have them read in this semester, this time I'm teaching it, I'm not having them read, because the book, is extremely long. It's a huge text, and it's encyclopedic in its scope. But what I wanted them to get a sense of is to put it in conversation with other authors in our course. But the things that I lecture about for when we're talking about the Swami's life and about the Kisan Sabhas, first of all, I give a lecture on the history of land tenure and agrarian conflict. So by that, I mean that I lecture on the different kinds of land settlement since the 18th century, with the rise of the East India Company state and the British Raj, and the way land settlement occurred in different places in different ways. So in the Bengal presidency, you have the Zamindari settlement, whereas in Madras presidency, you have Rayatwari settlement, and in other parts of India further west, you have in north, what's called Mahalwadi settlement. Different kinds of regimes of property ownership are instituted in the sort of late 18th and early 19th century. And then to some degree, I try to convey to the students the kinds of agrarian conflicts that emerge, particularly in the latter half, but not only, but especially in the latter half of the 19th and early part of the 20th century, and how that gives rise to some of the Kisan Sabha activism that really begins to mark the 1920s and 30s. So that's one big lecture on that. And then I also use this opportunity of the Swamiji's writings to lecture about political parties. Now I've already taught them in previous weeks that obviously there's the Congress, Indian National Congress has been established, and but I want them to know, also that there are other groups coming up from different sectors and different ideological backgrounds, and so obviously the importance of the communist movement, the rise of left politics, the creation, the foundation of the Communist Party of India, the different labor union movements, the Kisan Sabha, the provincial Kisan Sabha, and then of course the All India Kisan Sabha. And in previous weeks, I've already given them a kind of context in which to understand this, so they're aware of the rise of Gandhian non-cooperation and civil disobedience and Quit India. They know about all the elections in the 1930s and the World War I and World War II. So they're very familiar with that, and now they're filling in more detail from other political parts of the political spectrum. And so I talk about how you have the rise of the Congress Socialist Party, for instance, and then how that with the split at the Congress meeting in Tripura, you have and then the sort of departure of Subhas Chandra Bose, you have the Forward Bloc, and how all that relates to this. And then, of course, during World War II, the alliance with the Soviet Union and Great Britain prompted a sort of decision on the part of the Communist Party to support the war effort, and of course the consequences that had for the communists going forward, and the isolation they felt politically, and particularly Swami felt politically. And then I even take it up into the 1960s with the war with China, the split of the CPI into the CPI and the CPM. And then what we're going to do in weeks to come, we'll come back to this, because now we're reading Naipaul. We're actually in the second week of Naipaul, and next week we'll be talking more about the rise of the Naxalite movement and Maoist Red Guard action. And so we'll sort of take it even further forward in the coming weeks. So those are the kinds of lectures that I give with respect to the Swami. And of course, I'm using the Swami to sort of fill out the picture here. And why don't we move ahead to the next slide? Next slide, please. So the kinds of issues that come up, and again, I want to, the reading that they did for this particular class is the first 100 pages of the text. But the kinds of issues that do come up, the reason the Swami's life is so important is because it sheds really interesting light on a whole range of topics. And these are just a few of the topics that come up in our discussion and in my lectures. So of course, politics, let's just begin with politics. There's no particular order here. These are the kinds of issues, these are issues that come up because the students ask me questions based on their reading while I'm lecturing. They ask me about this, and also because I want to introduce these themes in the course of my teaching. So politics, the central, you could say in a way, this is a dominant political fact of the 20th century, or certainly the first half of the 20th century, was Mahatma Gandhi. And one of the things that's really comes out in reading this text is, and you see this in other texts as well, you see it in Nehru, for instance, but that Gandhi draws many people into the nationalist movement, to nationalist politics, anti-colonial, anti-British imperial politics. And the Swami is no exception to that. And so you get they've already read some of Gandhi's writings, and here the students get a sort of sense from the other side, someone like the Swami being recruited into nationalist politics in the late teens, early 1920s. Of course, as you all know, those of you who know anything about the Swami will know that between 1915 and 1919, he'd been very actively involved in Bhumihar Brahmin social reform movement. And it's in this period that he begins to get exposed more to broader political issues, and the nationalist movement is one of them. And he meets Gandhi, Swami meets Gandhi in 1920. I think Gandhi comes to Patna, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember. In any case, he goes to Nagpur. He goes to the Nagpur Congress. He also goes to the Ahmedabad Congress meeting in 1921. And there's a famous quote that many of us have used many times, where the Swami describes Gandhi delivering a talk, his speech at the Ahmedabad Congress, where Swami compares Gandhi to a Shiva who's sitting on a table, or I think Gandhi's either sitting or standing on a table, and he's hurling thunderbolts at the government in the Swami's description. And it's really a powerful image. So, Swami becomes a supporter of Gandhi. He works with Gandhi. He works with the Congress. He eventually, of course, in the late 1920s, formally create the creation of the Bihar Provincial Kisan Sabha, in what he calls what Swami in his autobiography calls the reform phase. But by the mid 1930s, the Swami is increasingly disillusioned with the Congress and with Gandhi. He feels that their ties to the big landlords, the big Maharajas, and the industrialists are too strong, and that they don't really have the best interests of the Kisans at heart. And this really comes to the fore in 1934 when the earthquake occurs in North Bihar, and the Swami is working overtime to deal with the struggles of the peasants who were really struggling under the disaster of the earthquake. And he meets with Gandhi, and Gandhi basically tells the Swami, the zamindars are not, Swami is concerned that the zamindars are not doing any rent remission. They're auctioning off cattle and properties. The peasants are being immiserated. And Gandhi says, well, the zamindars will take care of the kisans. And don't worry about it. And so Swami was very disappointed. He basically, at this point, breaks with Gandhi, and the Kisan Sabha enters a much more militant phase. But so the Swami provides a wonderful sense of an alternative politics and a political narrative to the Gandhian narrative, which is really the dominant narrative that we have. And so it's a wonderful way to convey to students that different narrative, that different perspective. Religion. So my interest actually originally in the Swami's life and my own work, I've been very interested in the political activities and political ideologies of asceticism and the political culture of asceticism. And so I find the Swami's reflections on sannyas and his description of his own decision to take sannyas to be very revealing. And so I have the students find that quite interesting. The Swami, of course, as those of you all will know, decides around the age of 16 or 17. He's been thinking about becoming a sannyasi quite a bit, but he finally makes the step in 1906 or 1907 when he takes sannyas and goes to Kashi and takes sannyas at the Aparnath Mutt. And it's actually a fascinating, because a comparison in some ways. I mean, there's lots of one can say about it, but my students in last week were just reading Naipaul's Million Mutinies Now book, where he describes the life of E.V. Ramaswamy from Tamil Nadu. And Ramaswamy, right at the same time, that is Periyar, at the very same period in the early, or first years of the 20th century, in the same moment, Periyar is also in Kashi. He's also in Benares, and he's thinking about becoming a sannyasi. Maybe even, if I remember correctly, he becomes for a while, he's a sannyasi, but he has a very different reaction. So we get two very different pictures of Kashi and sannyasi, the lifestyles and sort of day-to-day activities of sannyasis in Kashi in the early 20th century. So there's a lot that students can learn from that as well. On caste, I know I'm probably taking longer than I should, so I'll try and speed up a little bit. Another important theme is caste, of course, and there's so many ways in which the Swami's autobiography speaks to this theme. I will just highlight one, which is the Swami's reflections on pages 85 and 142 on the question of the dignity of labor. He has some really interesting remarks he questions, why is it? And the first time, on page 85 of the edition, this is the Hauser Jah scholarly edition, he's on his pilgrimages to Badrinath and Kedarnath up in the Himalayas, and I forget why I think he's talking about the different laborers who are actually physically carrying pilgrims on their backs up the hills, and he muses, he reflects on why is it that we think of certain labor as undignified, as degrading, and other labor as not degrading. And he says it's sort of insane. There's a dignity in labor. He actually comes back to that theme later on page 142 when he's discussing and thinking about the Bhumihar Brahmin, because he's recruited to actually assist with Bhumihar Brahmin social uplift after 1915. And Bhumihar, he sort of notes how Bhumihars have this sense of themselves as not quite Brahmin enough, and he wonders why it is that there's this notion that agriculture and cultivation is somehow inferior labor, when in fact he shows that, you know, cultivation in many ways, the labor of cultivation is superior to the labor of the priestcraft. So finally, moving on, he talks, you know, family is another interesting theme. This is, and I specifically relate this to Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay's own discussions of her marriage at a very young age. She is widowed as a child. Swami, of course, is also married at a very young age, and his wife dies when in his childhood, and that sort of frees him in a sense to become a sannyasi. And so the students get a nice way of learning about marriage, child marriage, from a very multiple perspectives. And finally, and in some ways, most importantly, I find the discussion of the nation and the idea of India. I think the Swami provides an interesting sort of comparison to how India is being thought of in both Nehru's discovery of India and Savarkar's Hindutva, which the students read. They only read the first 50 or 60 pages of Nehru's discovery of India, but they read the entirety of Savarkar's Hindutva. And, you know, there's, you know, as different as those two texts are, they do share an interesting similarity, which is they both make an appeal to the unity of India as a civilizational and its civilizational spirit. And there's a lot that can be said about that. Nehru does it really more from the point of view of a sort of underlying sort of popular culture spirit, whereas Savarkar appeals to a more Sanskrit Brahminical notion of the idea, the geography, the geographic totality of India from the ancient period on by appealing to Sanskrit, the Sanskrit textual corpus, whether it's the, you know, the Vedas or the Puranas or what have you. And of course, Savarkar's very famous equation is that, you know, you to be a Hindu, to be an Indian, the essence of Hindu and being Indian is to you know, Punya Bhumi and Pitri Bhumi. Your land of your birth should be the land of that you venerate, that you worship, and so the and so of course Savarkar's making that argument from a very abstract point of view. And so what's nice about the Swami's account is that, you know, he goes on this pilgrimage at the age of 17 or 18, 19 years old, that takes him all over North and Central India. And so he, in a sense, exemplifies in many ways that kind of what Savarkar is, in a sense, getting at, you could say. And even though obviously Savarkar and Sahajanand are poles apart in many ways, as are Nehru and Savarkar, yet they do, you know, there is a kind of interesting complementarity that I try to tease out with the students and think about. And this, just if we can advance to the next slide, we can look at, if we'll just advance one more slide, and we can look at what that looks like on a map, his journey across India, because he goes on a sort of a padyatra to many different important pilgrimage locations after he takes sannyas in 1906, 1907. So he spends 2 years traveling. Dr. Kailash ji, if you could advance to one more slide, please. Thoda aage badho. So you can sort of get a sense of this. The first part of the journey is on the far left, where he travels, and he does this mostly by foot. It's about a 3,000 mile journey almost, and he starts in Kashi and goes from there to Prayag and Chitrakoot and then to Kanpur. And this is in the far left image. From Kanpur, he heads down through Jhansi to Omkareshwar. And then from Omkareshwar and Ujjain and Indore, he heads up to Mathura. And then in the middle image, he goes, that sort of zooms in a little bit. He goes from Mathura up to Haridwar and Rishikesh. And again, he's walking the entire way. And much of this is done with his village friend, Hariyanand, I believe is his name, who also becomes a sannyasi, although not as dedicated. He sort of moves in and out between being a sannyasi and being a grihastha householder. But then finally, he heads up to Kedarnath and Badrinath, and then walks back to Rishikesh and Haridwar. And then on the far right image, he takes, mostly by rail, he travels by rail from Haridwar back to Kashi and then walks to Bharauli, where he stays for the monsoon before he decides to go back to Kashi in 1908 and undertake 7 years of vigorous study of the Shastras and Hindu philosophy and astrology and whatnot. So what's nice is that, you know, my students are all in their late teens, early 20s. You know, they're about the age that Sahajanand was when he undertook this long journey by foot. So I like them to think about that, can they imagine themselves walking 3,000 miles up into the Himalayas? In many cases, and then he was barefoot for much of this journey, and sometimes he wore ropes, sandals, but sometimes barefoot. So it was really a very rigorous, tough journey. Okay, so we can advance a little bit. So that just gives you a sense, and I talk a little bit about that with my students. Yes, so I wanted to say a little bit, I wanted to give you a flavor in closing of the reactions that students had to the Swami's autobiography. And their reactions occur in two formats. So as I mentioned earlier, every week the students write what are called response posts. The class has an online presence. We have what's called a Moodle. It's an online program where students can post their reactions for everybody to read, everybody in the class, to the readings and the films and everything. And my lectures, they can just post. They can talk about whatever they want. So this is an example of the kind of post that a student made when we were dealing with in week 8 or week 7 with the Swami's life, and he was interested in the educational side. So it's just gives you. I find it fascinating because you get a sense of what the students are seeing through their eyes, right? And it's a wonderful comment on this. You know, Swami was a brilliant student as a boy. I mean, when you read the autobiography, you know, I mean, this guy is amazing. He has a prodigious memory. You know, he's writing this memoir in 1940s, and he's remembering so many details about the different books he read when he was a teenager, his curriculum when he was a student, and learning language, and it's just an amazing memory feat that he has. In any case, he talks about how the Swami went to after he studied Hindi and Urdu both. He was then accepted with a scholarship into a program at the German Mission High School in Ghazipur to learn English. And then he was ready. He was winning scholarships left and right. He was a brilliant student. So it was enormously, disappointing to his family that he decided to take sannyas. But the student was fascinated by the way in which, as he writes, and I'm starting down in the middle here, through describing I'm quoting the student, through describing his English education, Sahajanand's description of being taught the Bible really stood out to me. He writes, quote, "In the course of teaching, they would criticize other religions, especially Hinduism," close quote. Obviously, this bothered the young boy, who actually stood up to the teachers and reprimanded them for criticizing another religion. He reminded the teachers that they were in school, a place to learn, not a place for religious criticism. And so, the student then goes on to reflect on what role did this experience in the German mission high school have? What role did it have in influencing Sahajanand to become a sannyasi? Okay, next slide, please. Another example. Aage, zara aage बढ़ाइए. So now they write weekly response posts, but also during the semester, students write papers. The second paper was a paper that allowed the students to think about the Sunil Kilnani's book in relation to the other sources that we read. And so this student was really interested in the question of debt. And she references the film Mother India, and how the Radha's family in the film is going in debt, losing their land to Sukilal, the moneylender. And each of the numbers here, 17, 18, 19, those were footnotes referencing the sources. And so she's interested in how this compares really to questions of land ownership, agrarian tenure. And she talks about Sahajanand Saraswati in his memoir, where he describes his own family history, as that his family had a small zamindari, but over time, the property was divided into so many smaller plots and things worsened, and we eventually had to depend entirely on cultivation for subsistence. So they go from being having a sizable zamindari to being subsistence agriculturalists over time. So she was quite interested in that. Next slide, please. Okay. One student was really quite taken by the whole issue of the iconization of women, the idea of we talked earlier in the semester, even when Nehru visits the villages in his discovery of India, he describes how he would arrive in a village for a speech, right? And the peasants, the kisans, would greet him with a cheer of Bharat Mata Ki Jai. And so Nehru would then engage with the kisans about, well, what is this Bharat? Who is this Bharat Mata? And in other, we also, during partition, there was a lot of talk about the abduction of women during partition, and how the status of abducted women became an index of the honor of the state, right? And that's a big issue in the partition sort of moment. So this student was quite interested in this issue of the woman as an icon, as a symbol of the country, as a mother. And we talk about this obviously in the film Mother India, which has a whole history of its own that's quite fascinating. In any case, she remarks, because the Swami also talks in a way, he provides interesting evidence here in his autobiography. She writes, by establishing India as a feminine power, politicians may celebrate the country's strength, but also call its citizens to action. After all, it is noble to defend a woman, especially a mother figure. Women were often pushed aside and considered too weak to truly hold power. During his travels in the early 1900s, Swami Sahajanand Saraswati remarked that the heart of a woman is naturally very delicate. This is in quotes. And he implies that such a heart must be cared for and protected. His statement certainly does not suggest that a woman could wield the same political or religious power as a man could because of this weakness. So in a sense, she's, using Swami to construct a gender critique of the nationalist movement. And perhaps beyond the nationalist movement, is a critique of patriarchy. Okay, let's move ahead. Another theme that's quite nice that I like is the romanticization of village life that we get. And this student was, bringing together a number of different films and also the writings of William Wedderburn. William Wedderburn is a writer whom Gandhi actually references in Hind Swaraj, in his text Hind Swaraj. Gandhi, of course, really elevated the village as a place where the true India resided, much in contrast to someone like Ambedkar, who thought the village was a den of backwardness and caste and oppression. And so this student was really interested in exploring this question. And she points to Swami's life in the village growing up being, incredibly difficult and physically trying. Everyone in his village grew sugarcane because, quote, there was neither scope for any other trade or profession, nor were there any other employment opportunities. So, it's a very unvarnished, the Swami provides a very unvarnished, unromanticized view of the village, in contrast to that ideal notion of the village that Gandhi and Wedderburn and others in what's, Ruskin, for instance, were promoting in the turn of the century. So those are just some responses by students to the text, and there are many others. And I will sort of close out here with one more slide, Age Badaye, this final slide, and thinking about other, new hopes for the future, the things I'd like to see. Obviously, one of the things that Kailash Jha in his 3 or 4 discussions on folk brain talked about a month or 2 ago were the preservation of records, and part of that was the preservation of the records at the Bhita ashram near Patna, the Swami's headquarters for the Kisan Sabha. And I had the privilege of visiting the ashram with Dr. Satyajit Singh and others and colleagues as well in 2017. It's a wonderful location. It's an incredible resource. And, my hope is that as the ashram gets, the archive gets formalized and it's available for research, that many of us can begin not only doing our own research there, but also begin sending our students and maybe even digitizing records so that students can have access, because it's just an enormously rich and incredibly wide range of material. And, one of the things that we do at Wesleyan that we encourage our students to do is actually do original research in archives for their senior research projects. So my hope is and expectation is that as we move forward, that this kind of archival institutionalization process will move forward as well. And it's really, I have to say, it's thanks to Kailash Jha, thanks to Dr. Kailash Mishra, to Dr. Satyajit Singh, and others in the archive and the ashram trust that this kind of valuing of heritage and tradition and institutions and records is being encouraged, and I think we should do all we can to support it. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share my teaching with you. I hope I haven't gone on too long, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, sir. It was a really very classic presentation. Classic presentation also in a sense that the way you have prepared the syllabus for the undergraduate students, combining everything, his liking for the village life, then, connecting it with Gandhi, then Savarkar and other, Ambedkar and other things that were happening in this country, like from his childhood, he's being a very intelligent child, and his proficiency of writing his meticulous diary, giving every detail, These are the few things that everybody should learn about Swami Sahajanand Saraswati. It is very unfortunate that he is not taught in the Indian university and school curriculum. We, the people of India, should take lesson that a man like Sahajanand Saraswati, we have a farmer crisis still going on in India. And it is the right time when we should understand the capability and ability of Swami Sahajanand Saraswati, his ways, his thinkings in his approach to tackle the issues, mainly about the marginal, farmers, farm laborers, and the tribals. The way he worked with the tribals was a great thing. He worked like an anthropologist and ethnographer. He went there, lived with them, the way they were living, tried to understand everything, empathy and sympathy, everything he collected, and then he talked about. No anthropologist before that went to the tribal area and did that extensive study living with the tribals. He did it. He was a swapaki. He used to cook for himself. Otherwise, somebody, like a very man of a very, or women of a very dharmic pravritti used to cook for him. And he studied with them. That exhibited his power, his capacity of going to the remote area, working for the community who deserve the immediate, interventions from all walks of life. And he exhibited this. Sir, we have so many applause for you from so many people. Kailash Jha sir se shuru karte hain. It will. Thanks for your support on preservation front. I am sharing. COVID did not allow your initiative. Thanks. Yeah, he says. And we have Puspa Kumari. She says, your experience is really commendable. All the best for your future endeavors. This is the remark for you. She has been asking you some questions also. Uh, we have Dr. Jaya Burma. She teaches history in Delhi University. She says, very good observation by Professor Pinch. Aparna Vedic again says, impressive syllabus design. So interesting to see the connections the students were able to make. Yeah.
So I want to just mention here that I've had the privilege and pleasure of extensive conversations with Professor Vedic over teaching and research, and we've even talked about syllabus design. And so I've benefited a great deal from her suggestions and insights. And we also had a wonderfully entertaining discussion with her colleagues at Ashoka University, particularly Professor at the time Vice Chancellor, I think, Rudrangshu Mukherjee, and colleague Mahesh Rangarajan. And we had a very interesting meeting talking about the history curriculum at Wesleyan, particularly we have one required course at Wesleyan. It's a different course. It's about theory and methodology and historiography. And in that course, actually, I also designed a part of that course is on the partition. We have a case study on partition where students read primary sources. And that's the one required course that we have in our department. In any case, Professor Vedic and I have had many conversations on teaching, and I've learned a lot from her, and I look forward to learning more.
So I would request Professor Vedic to, if she can manage, deliver one lecture on any dimension of Swamiji for our channel also. If she agrees, it will be a matter of great pride for all of us. I request you, ma'am. And we have some Rajesh from Delhi University. He's using probably his wife's number and says, great to see you after a long time, Professor Pinch. Rajesh from Delhi University. He remembers you.
Rajesh was with me along with several other colleagues in 2017 when we visited the ashram from the Bita ashram, Raghavpur, Swamiji's ashram. So nice to see you. Nice to hear from you, Rajesh ji.
Thank you, Professor Aparna Vedic, for accepting my invitation. Would request you to share your mobile number so that or email ID so that I can talk to you. And so we have Puspa Kumari again. She says Swamiji's work on the poor and marginal farmers needs to be reviewed by the government. Your say, Professor Peach. What do you think about
Absolutely,
it?
absolutely. I agree 100%. And I think probably the government is taking interest based on what I've seen. There seems to be quite a bit of interest in Swamiji. I mean, given if all the Hindi newspaper stories that came out in the past 2 weeks about Swamiji being taught in an American university is any indication, it seems to me that there's a lot of interest on the part of people in high places, let me put it that way, having an interest in Swamiji's work on the poor, on the and his whole life, his whole, his struggle not just with agrarian conflict, but also an agrarian oppression, but also with party politics. I mean, he had a fascinating sort of view on the way politics plays out. And so I think, I think certainly his life and work should be made more available. And I think it's a very easy life to teach about. My students find it very accessible. And I think it would be a wonderful addition to any curriculum. If the question was about a curriculum or maybe about more generally, either way, yeah.
The similar, curiosity we had from Professor Aparna Vedic, part of it has already been described by you and said. Hello, Vijay and Jha Sahab. Lovely to see you on this platform. We are waiting to hear about your students' response to Swamiji's writing. So you have already you have talked about. Do you want to elaborate it a little bit?
No, I will only say, I hope I didn't take too long in getting to that material. I wanted to situate and provide context at the beginning for many of the viewers and listeners, because I think it's important to understand the American system context, which Professor Vedic already understands. She's taught in this system for several years. But for many viewers, the different educational university context is quite important, I think, and because that helps people appreciate the flexibility that we have in being able, as an individual, I can bring whatever I want. I make all the decisions about my course. I don't have anybody looking down from higher up in my institution, my university, saying, no, you can't teach this or you can't teach that. I make all the decisions. I decide how many pages the students read, actually, the students decide how many pages the students will read. I assign the pages. Whether the students read them is another matter. I often assign too many pages, and so it's difficult reading. But I assign the number of papers they have to write, and I get to choose whether they do an exam or whether they do papers. It's entirely up to me. So the flexibility here in my university system, anyway, I think makes a big difference. And yes, I see Kailash Jha is saying the ashram is completely.
It's saying that ashram is changed, then, and he has kept on sharing the photographs of new looks of the ashram, the renovations and all those things. They look very dynamic now. And as you must be knowing, Mr. Jha is living in Patna only nowadays.
Yes.
And every day he sees that new things are coming up.
Yeah,
So thank you, Jha Sahab. We have one curiosity again from Sri Anil Savaria ji. He said, "Hi, could you reflect on Swamiji's connection with the communist movement? Did he have a connection?"
Absolutely. So yes, I mean, I guess I didn't say enough about that, but yes, he did. He was part of that. I mean, what happened when the Communist Party was founded in 1925 in Kanpur, actually, formally sort of created in India, Communist Party of India. It really it encouraged, rather than being a sort of top-heavy organization, it encouraged, for many years, local, provincial organizations to take the lead. So Kisan Sabhas and work trade union movements and things of that nature. And it really wasn't until the 30s that it really, the communist movement began to formally get more involved. Partly communists and socialists were joining the Congress. So in 1934, you have the Congress Socialist Party. But yes, the Swami was very profoundly involved. He read Marx and Lenin. He was profoundly involved by communist thinkers, and thought of himself really as a supporter of the international communist movement. In World War II, and there's a wonderful, toward the end of the volume, toward the end of the autobiography, he discusses, because he's in prison in the 40s because of the opposition to the war, but of course the Soviet Union joins the war and becomes an ally with Great Britain in 1942 when Hitler makes the sort of famous mistake of attacking Russia, right? Napoleon makes the mistake in the early 18th century, and Hitler makes the mistake in the mid 20th century. And suddenly the Soviet Union goes from being a neutral to being on the side of the Allies in World War II. And that forces a decision on the part of the communists, including Sahajanand, to no longer oppose the war effort. Suddenly this war, this imperial war, World War II, what they had thought of was being thought of as a war between these imperial powers, suddenly for the communists became a people's war. And so they know the communists, and Sahajanand also, he talks about this, decided to no longer be obstructive in the war effort. And so, yeah, he was very much influenced by the communist movement and by Lenin and Marx. And he often would say, he becomes a Dundee sannyasi sometime in 1914 or 15, I forget the exact date. After he takes sannyas in 1907, but then becomes a Dundee later. But later on in life, he says, I take this dund and I consider it I will use it to fight on behalf of the peasants. And so he sees that his role as working. He's essentially a Marxist and a Leninist. So yeah, he's profoundly influenced by that, and he sees. It's also another thing that's quite interesting. Even looking back, that's what makes his memoir so interesting, because he's looking back. He's writing in 1940, and whenever we read something, as historians, we read these memoirs, we always have to ask, why is he writing? Who's his audience? And things like that. But what's interesting also is that he's looking back at himself in the early 1900s when he was a young man, and he was, he acknowledges that he was a very orthodox Brahmin. And he describes this in great detail and almost in loving detail. At the same time, he takes a very critical eye. He examines that life very critically for its, different economic and social and cultural implications. And yes, Dund comes from Chanakya. Interesting. Well, I think Anil Sanweria should also give a talk on folk brain.
will tell him to, because Dandi is the symbol of uh, just and ordered situations with power.
Yeah.
So even the judges,
Yeah.
they are called dandadhikari.
Yeah.
They have so that is
It's a
true.
symbol. It's a
But
symbol.
you're
Symbol of
getting
war.
him connected with but you're getting him connected with Marxism has a region, and you have connected it with that sense, and politics also. Yeah, jurisprudence is the part of politics, Anil Saab. Thank you. And senior Kailash sir is telling that one ashram is ready, and next is Niyamatpur ashram. So he has been preparing for that also. That also. That also. So we had few curiosities. You have already explained, most answered, and these are the uh, there are few people who are working on them, on Swami Sahajanand, and they are exhibiting their concern that if the similar situation can be created in India also, wherein we as a group of scholars and academically concerned people can give a representation to the government of India and also the state government of Bihar to start teaching Sahajanand Saraswati in the college and university level. If it is done, it will be a real tribute to the Dandidhari Swami. I think this will be a nice gesture from us. So I wanted, when I have seen two people addressing you as Vijay, our senior Kailash sir and Professor Badik. And you were very proud of your this Indian nomenclature Vijay. And when they were addressing you as Vijay and you were getting this name recognized, I was remembering you know an anthropologist, Evans Pritchard. When Evans Pritchard was E.A. Evans Pritchard, when he was working with the New Era, he uh, was given a New Year's name for himself, and by the newer chief, and he was enjoying that name. With this name he used to work with the people and collect the data, and the work that he did is a master work in the area of ethnography and anthropology in the world. So I think you are justifying your nomenclature, Vijay. So it was really a very, very meaningful and fruitful discussion on this channel, Folk Brain. We are really very, very thankful to you, sir, for accepting our request to deliver this lecture. This was really an eye opener for many of us. Thank you so very much for coming here and delivering. I am extremely sorry for not taking senior Kailash sir, Kailash Chandra Jha sir, because he has a serious problem with his, Wi-Fi system. So we are not in a position to take him. Otherwise, he had some plans for you, and he was just trying to interact with you in a very casual but very meaningful manner. Anyway, we can again plan to bring you together, maybe after a month and so, and the new area of knowledge can be discussed.
Jasab and I have had many very exciting travels across North India and Central India, and both for pleasure as well as research. And we have lots of great stories to tell. So I would love to have a chance to interact with him again on this venue.
Okay. So thank you, friends. And tomorrow, Angna Bordoloi from, Majuli, Assam, she is going to talk about the sericulture, the Eri, Andi silk, castor silk. So please join us, Folk Brain, at 7:30 p.m. tomorrow. Till then, bye-bye, take care. God bless you all. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much, Professor. Thank you.
you.
Thank you.